The Ring of Gyges is a selection from Plato's broader work, The Republic. In this, we have the character of Glaucon, who in real life was the brother of Plato, speaking with Socrates and other people. So Socrates is being challenged by Glaucon, and the challenge is this. Glaucon wants to hear a defense of justice, a defense in which justice is better than injustice. Going back to our question of why be good, he's putting forth the extreme challenge, which is not just a practical argument as to why justice is better than injustice for, the consequences, etc., but he wants to hear justice praised for itself, justice for its own sake. So, going back to our context, he's asking Socrates to defend goodness for the sake of goodness, why one should be good simply for the sake of goodness itself. And what Glaucon is going to do essentially is take the role of what we might call today the devil's advocate. He is going to speak in favor of what he calls the unjust life. So he begins by presenting his analysis of the nature and origin of justice. And when you look at our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, we'll see that this is, that Thomas Hobbes, his view of justice is rather similar to Glaucon's view of justice. So what is Glaucon's conception of justice, both its nature and its origin? So it begins by saying that people think, intuitively, that doing wrong is naturally good, and to be wronged is bad. Now, he probably doesn't mean going around doing, psychotically just, murderous things just to do psychotic murder. He means things that would be, profitable. For example, if a person could, lie and deceive in other ways to get an advantage in business, they would see that as good, to get away with it. And then to be harmed in return, they would, of course, see that as bad. And it's the view that, doing unto others is good, and being done unto in bad ways is bad. So what happens, according to Glaucon, is this, is that when people do wrong to others, they see this as good, being wronged is bad, but once they get a taste of both, they get to be on both ends of the stick, so to speak, poking people with a stick of injustice and getting the sharp end of injustice in their eye, people notice that the suffering of injury, being on the receiving end of injustice and being wronged, vastly exceeds in badness the good of inflicting it. In part because perhaps one might say it's one person doing injustice to others, but lots of other people out in the world perhaps doing injustice back. So the way he looks at it is that when people have done wrong and suffered it, the people who cannot avoid being wronged and can't get away with doing wrong, they come to a practical conclusion that it is profitable to come to an agreement with each other. And this agreement is to not inflict harms on others, nor be harmed in return. And again, this will be copied or echoed later by our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes. And so what people do, at least according to Glaucon, is they make laws and covenants, and these commands they name lawful and just. And so this ends up for him being where justice is coming from. So continuing with the origin and essence of justice, it is a middle ground between two extremes. The very best is to do wrong without paying any penalty, and of course the worst is to be wronged without the power of revenge. So the best is to be able to do bad stuff and get away with it, and the very worst is to be the victim with no power of vengeance. So this is a mean between two extremes. And this, of course, is sort of echoing or imitating virtue theory, a mean between two extremes. So why do people like justice? Well, Glaucon in a way says people kind of don't like it. It is just that people welcome it and honor it because of weakness, that they lack the power to do wrong. And if someone had the power to do wrong, they would not make any agreement with others to this end. They would not say to others, okay, I want to inflict injury on you, as long as you don't inflict it on me. And his reasoning is, if you have the power to get away with things, it would be madness to engage in this conception of justice, because you'd have nothing to gain. Essentially, you'd be saying to people, okay, I can do anything I want and get away with stuff, and you can do nothing to me, yet I will decide to restrain myself. And according to the way Glaucon sees it, that would be madness. So a fairly negative view of the nature of people. So why then are people just, according to Glaucon? Oh, the reason is essentially, again, weakness. People do justice, and they do so against their will. They would rather, do injustice because they lack the power to get away with it, or so he claims. So now we turn to the actual ring of Gyges from which this selection gets its name. And what he presents is what in the philosophy business we call a thought experiment. And a thought experiment occurs, shockingly enough, when you conduct an experiment by thinking about it. And this may seem like an odd thing to do, but there are good reasons to engage in thought experiments. The most obvious practical reason is the matter of cost, because real experiments, non-thought experiments, can be quite expensive, and there also can be, depending on the context, concerns about ethics, and also concerns about practicality, in addition to not just cost. It may simply be incredibly difficult, regardless of cost, or perhaps even impossible, to engage in a real experiment. To use an example in the sciences, Albert Einstein, the famous guy, he came up with all kinds of thought experiments for his various theories, in large part because the technology to test them did not exist at the time. And now some of these assertions, these hypotheses are being confirmed because of the availability of technology. Now, in philosophy, we often do thought experiments because, again, cost, we don't have the big budgets of the sciences, but also because you can imagine a scenario and do things, again, that would not be practical. You may wonder, of course, what is the value of a thought experiment? Because when one does a thought experiment, you're essentially telling a story. And the way, of course, stories go is based on the person telling the story. It's kind of like when, kids or even adults are having a debate about who would win in a fight between Superman and the Hulk or somebody. And kind of the sad answer, cynical answer is, it depends on who's writing it. It's all based on how it's written. So a weak point of thought experiments, of course, is you do the thinking, you get the result, and then there's the question of how useful is this? They often tend to be sort of intuition pumps, going back to our appeal to intuition or argument by intuition, where you tell a story, lay out the thought experiment, and you try to make it so it seems convincing, and then give reasons as to why it should be accepted. So back to the actual thought experiment. So Glaucon thinks that if you took two people, a just person who claims to be just, and an unjust person, I guess, who admits to being unjust, and you somehow granted them the freedom to do whatever they like. You took away all the external punishments and rewards. And then what you do in this experiment is observe them and see what they do. Glaucon believes that the just person, allegedly just person, if he took away all the external punishments for doing unjust things and took away the external rewards for doing just things, they would be unjust. And the same, of course, the unjust person would obviously be unjust. His reasoning for this is what today we might call kind of like a biological or sociobiology or evolutionary account, because interestingly, Glaucon asserts that all organisms, by nature, have a desire for undue gain, and they see this as a good. In other words, that living creatures want more than they are entitled to, more than they deserve. And in the case of people is that we are forced by the law to honor equality, but we really don't want to. We're compelled to do this, or so he claims. Now, this is where he brings in the actual story of the Ring of Gyges. Been a long time getting to it, but here's the tale itself. So the story is about a shepherd named Gyges, who was, at the time when he was shepherding, served the king of Lydia at that time. Apparently this is the origin story told by during the time of Glaucon and Plato, the rulers of Lydia at the time. This is kind of the origin story. They supposedly, at least according to what I've been told by other philosophers and historians, that they were proud of this origin story. And here's how the story goes. So Gyges was a shepherd out tending his sheep, and there was a terrible rainstorm and a terrible earthquake that split open the earth. And he saw in this, this chasm, this crevice, something that would seem to be out of like a fantasy or science fiction story, that within this crevice, within this chasm, was a mysterious giant bronze horse. And summoning up his courage, he goes down into the horse, looks around and finds the body of a giant with a ring upon it. He grabs the ring and then departs, taking it with him. And he seemingly forgets about it. He goes back to the meeting, with the shepherds with the king. So even back then, they apparently had committee meetings, but no PowerPoint. So I guess it was perhaps somewhat better. And while they're talking and so forth, he gets bored, as one often does in meetings, and he turns the ring around, and he finds suddenly that they're talking about him like he's not there. And he realizes that he has a ring of invisibility, that he can activate it, become invisible. And so what he does is he goes to the king's wife and says to her, essentially, hey, look what I can do, turns invisible. And she, being the faithful spouse, well, non-faithful, agrees to help him. They murder the king, and he takes over the kingdom, and they live happily ever after through the power of this ring. And then according to the mythology of the ring, eventually it is lost, of course, but it succeeded in getting that family on the throne. So what then is the point of this tale? Well, again, this is the thought experiment he presents in some detail, and he asks us to imagine that we had two rings of invisibility. So instead of just the one from the Ring of Gyges, we got two of them. And the way we give the allegedly just person and the unjust person the freedom to do what they like is we give them these rings. We say, here you go, have a ring of invisibility to the supposedly just person. We go to the unjust person and say, here's a ring of invisibility as well, and we see what they do. And Glaucon asks us to check our intuitions. What do we think people would do if they had the power to be invisible at will? And he says they would, of course, do bad things, he claims. Why? Well, again, his claim is that people are only just under compulsion. We are forced to be good. That we don't do this willingly. And that justice is not my private good, not your private good. It's simply a sort of intrinsic thing that if we can't get away with being bad, we'll be good because the alternative is worse. And he asserts that everyone believes that injustice is more profitable, more advantageous than justice. And then the question is, is he right about that? And if you agree with him, you would say this is a good thought experiment for proving his point. And of course, if you disagree, you would think that it's not so good. Now, he does consider, in case you wonder, would everyone, given the ring, would everyone be bad? And Glaucon does consider the possibility of someone who claimed to be just and actually was just, and if they got the ring, they wouldn't do anything bad. They might use it for good things, like they might put it on and go and help people and be like a hero or something. And Glaucon says that person, the way the rest of us would look at them, we would of course praise them to their face for how good and kind they were, maybe ask if we could borrow the ring, because we wouldn't we wouldn't want them, of course, to get ideas. If someone just says, "Oh, if I had the ring, the terrible things I would do," and it would be foolish, of course, to give that person with a ring of invisibility ideas about being bad. You'd want to praise them and say, "Oh yes, you're such a good person. You're so heroic having that ring and doing all these good things." Now, maybe I could borrow it for a little while, perhaps. So he thinks that almost everybody with the power to do evil and get away with it would do evil. So then he presents his challenge that Socrates has to address, which is this choice between lives. And so he asks us to imagine a pretty extreme scenario. So we've had a magic ring, we've had two magic rings, in fact, perhaps three, the original, two copies. And now we'll put forth a challenge that's even more extreme. So Glaucon asks us to imagine a truly just person, a person who really is in fact just, and someone who's unjust. And we put them in a contest against each other, put face to face, so to speak. Now, he really stacks the deck in favor of the unjust person, but this is the challenge he puts to Socrates, because his challenge to Socrates is trying to prove that justice by itself, taking away the extrinsic rewards and extrinsic punishments for being unjust, would still be worth having. It would be the better choice. And so he wants to set it up for that extreme test. So what does the unjust person get? Well, the condition again is that the unjust person has got to be able to get away with being unjust and not be punished, because otherwise they're just being good to avoid being punished. And they also have to get the rewards of seeming to be just, because otherwise people would just be just to get the rewards. So he makes, hypothetically, the unjust person perfect in their injustice. Not like truly perfect, because he does allow they can mess up. So they'll be like a clever craftsperson at injustice. They will be good at what they do, being bad, namely. So just like a person who's really skilled at something like computer programming, or a person who's a skilled surgeon or a skilled carpenter, they have a good idea of what they can do and what they can't do. And of course, they'll stick with what they can succeed at doing, and unless they absolutely must, wouldn't attempt to do things they know they won't be able to do. So the unjust person knows what he can get away with, what he can accomplish. Glaucon also sets it up so even the person makes up a mistake or makes an error, they can set things right. Doesn't say exactly how they do this, but they can accomplish this. So if he does wrong and does so, correctly, which is an odd way to put it, they will remain secret, because if he gets caught, then he won't, he'll go against this would go against the conditions, because he wouldn't be good at being bad. Just like if someone's good at doing electrical work, if they do it correctly, then it would work. It wouldn't, fail or catch on fire. So when the unjust person is doing injustice effectively, they don't get caught. Now, of course, the person, even though he's presented as being, or he or she is being presented as being really good at injustice, Glaucon does consider that they need to maintain their reputation for justice as well. So the first thing is they're really good at being unjust, and they're really good at getting away with it. They must also have a reputation for justice. So even if they're actually unjust, as he says, they maintain their reputation for justice. To do this, they must have the ability to persuade, so they're good at convincing people. And if convincing people through persuasion fails, they are good at using force to bring that about. So they can do what it takes to maintain their reputation for justice. Also, by the experiment, they have courage, strength, friends, and wealth. So the way he sets it up essentially is the unjust person is not caught, and people think they're just. So they avoid the extrinsic punishments for being unjust. No one catches them, no one punishes them. They also get the extrinsic rewards for seeming to be just. Everyone thinks they're a just person. Now, this, of course, is an extreme case, so we obviously would not know if there was ever anybody who was perfectly unjust, because we would think of them as being the most just people of all. They would, be the people of history we think as being super just. But of course, we do have people that almost get away with it. If it wasn't for those meddling kids, where they have a good reputation, then they do something and they get kind of caught, but it doesn't really hurt them that much, and they're able to keep on going. So just enough that we know, okay, they're doing bad things, but even in that case, they're able to get away with it and still be successful. And so we can think of historical figures for people from present day who are good at being unjust and are good at getting away with it. And even if they get caught, they just are able to get away with it. They just keep on, being unjust. And again, the difference is that Glaucon's unjust person, we just think they're just. We never realize it. But again, to have examples, we can think of in the real world, we have to think of people who did unjust things, kind of got caught, or at least people suspect, but they're still able to do quite well for themselves. In contrast, we have the just person. This person is truly just. So they're a good person for real. Now, because of the setup that Glaucon gives, the challenge he puts to Socrates, the just person must not get any of the external benefits of being just. All the reputation, the rewards from others, he can't or she can't get those. Why? Well, again, his question is not why should you be just for the rewards. His question is he wants Socrates to defend justice for its own sake. Why should you be good for just being for the sake of justice? So he has to take away everything from this person and leave them only with justice itself. All of their reputation is taken away, and in fact, the exact opposite holds for them. Everyone thinks that they are terrible and bad. So this is a person who truly is good, but everyone thinks they're bad. So they get none of the external rewards for appearing just. All the rewards, honor, and praise, quite the opposite. Everyone thinks that they are terrible, even though they're doing good things. Now, historical examples of this, for people who are Christians, Jesus would be probably a pretty good example, because in his own time, he was looked at as according to the tales of the Bible, he was considered, a terrible threat and sentenced to death and executed through crucifixion. But for people who believe in Christianity, he, of course, is the perfectly just person. And that, of course, in this case, we know that, or we believe that the person is just, but it provides a pretty good example of someone who could be perfectly just, but still regarded as somebody that's terrible. Or we can think of people to give examples of people we think of as good people who were, ended up being regarded as terrible and treated terribly. Now, in the movies, of course, the good person is, rewarded, the bad person punished, but Glaucon is it set up so that doesn't occur, hypothetically. So the good person, the just person, everyone thinks they're unjust, they're never rewarded from the outside, there's no recognition. The unjust person always gets away with it. Now, a person might bring in, mentioning religion, might bring in religion and say, well, wouldn't the unjust person eventually would be punished, by God or whatever religious or supernatural agency is involved, and the good person would be rewarded. And Socrates, is facing an extreme challenge in which all the external rewards. So it's not that the bad person would, say, oh, be good because otherwise you'll go to hell, or be good for heaven. It's just, is justice on its own worth having? So very extreme challenge. Socrates, of course, being Socrates, argues in favor of the just life, and then later Aristotle criticizes him for this, saying this just seems like a terrible idea. So that's the challenge of the Ring of Gyges. What is the answer? Well, Socrates is a definite answer for the side of justice, but taking away like the extreme case, where none of us are generally going to be like the perfectly unjust person or the perfectly just person, but we all have to make that choice. Are we going to be a good person even when we can get away with being bad, or are we going to be bad when we can get away with being bad? Fundamental question in ethics. So stay safe, stay good, or at least stay appearing good, and I'll see you in the future.